Chapter 1. Like a tree planted by the rivers of water. From the men of old which have their portion in this life, who hath disposed the whole world? Long ago, before the world that is was, before the fountains of the deep were broken up, and the continents divagated, before only one moon rose alone upon the hour of gloaming, before even time was measured by day and night, aye, long ago, how different the world was. Reposed upon its special bed of youth, the earth toiled not, neither did it spin. All the heavens lay somnolent in both solar motion and eternal reach. To and fro all the world laid still from sea to sea. 'Twas in this initial state of universe that the souls of men first arose to know beauty and love and begin that long, long journey which is everlasting. For the spirit will endure when the body has perished. Alas! The memory of such days hath become all but lost to men of this age. Such days lay not even as shadows, with vague redolence in morning's wake. Thus it is of the lives of men which are fragile in their eternal worth. How few there are whose souls indeed have stirred in such simplicity and sincerity as to behold these truths. Behold, if a quiet word or verse by verse should reveal the power to touch the heart, then men would surely remember the song of Aradia, for there is redemption in remembrance. If one should take care to walk the edge of the wood in the quiet hours of twilight, the sound, the subtle song of memories, deep and furtive as the roots of the world, can be heard whispering of a time when both elves and men, and even fae, those creatures of purest magic and mirth, roamed with gleeful eyes beneath the sky, and more than dared to dream, but romanced the world with righteousness. For such were men of old in those days, that they called upon the name of the one who 'twas as the image of jealousy. In those days the world that now is was not, and the world that was called Elfant. If one looks to a map of those days, he will see that in the far north and in the east, but not so far as to be upon the very shores of the Sea of Sylvanar, lay a wide realm of mountain, wood, and lealand. In these regions did elves and fairies dwell, though it is that fairies dwelt in both the east and west. But it is the lay of Lore and the outer laying provinces around it where the dark elves dwelt. This is where our journey must begin. But what exactly are elves, and what do elves do? Why, they are shepherds of the forests, guardians of trees, and the nurturers of their saplings, not altogether unlike Ents or Dryads, save that they are as men, but immortal in their youth. For youth is most precious. It is youth that men, in their ignorance, so oft do waste, as though time 'twas not wont to cast its care upon a soul. The elves tend the gardens of woodlands, grooming both bark and bower, and speaking with those gentle beings as a man might speak to his friend. Yet they have not been appointed arduous tasks, in that trees are obsequious beings to all the world, and by nature need they little fawning. Nay, theirs is a great work, with much patience and care, with the long suffering of a predestination, such as could only befit earth and giants, whose strophic roots do not weather the soil, but rather hold the world in its place. They stand watch. Let the field be joyful, and all that is therein. Then shall all the trees of the wood rejoice. For the world is joyful in that the elves have tended the woods. By their magic do men find air to breathe, and fill their lungs with the spirit of life, which without whom could there be no life, and without which a terrible void of beauty shouldst cover the world. Then would not men be as but creatures of the sea, a shadeless vault of insipid lands, barren of bark and bower, and dolorous for lack of their furtive powers. Such is the magic of trees, and the elves understood these things. Hear now the sound of trees, as the elves hear them. They are silent, yet they are not statues. They move, and yet they stand planted in their contrasts of candid hue, bark and leaf whispering, wanting not, yet desiring, with reach of bower, to cast their shadows upon the world, and in such motion speak their comfort and consolations of grace. So Verdesk, are these spirits? They are not stone, yet they are not flesh. So immortal as the elves they seem, for they endure both in beauty and subtle change against time, when time cannot endure against itself. For men will cast an eye and say, behold, see this green, how these leaves express themselves so simply in veins of honesty, as only nature can be honest. For when hath nature yet left its natural use? This is the sound of trees, the quiet speaking to the soul of man by simply standing still betwixt the earth and sky, and sharing life. Aye, man has passed by and breathed the breath exhaled of trees, and yet the trees have stood silent still, unnoticed. Yet they never hate. Lee of Lintar and Lay of Lorn, those vastest of elf and woodland realms, merged on the northmost roots of the thundering hills. Hills which, in those days, echoed neither rumor nor fearful whisper of orc. Rather were they dressed and decked with tree and flower, unscathed, unhewn. And thus the elves named these mountains the Lathril Hills. Hills which were in truth merely the northernmost fingers of the wayward god. The voice of elf and maiden lingered ever upon the rills and down low in the valleys of this region. The hills were filled with laughter. Well indeed did the Lathril Hills echo words softly spoken to ring them out in a chorus of song and poetry. Well did those valleys echo the hymns of Aifeloth, and the flute of Imagil 'twas ever the sweetest of those choruses. Lorn 'tis an airy wood, its vast folds and grove of willow, elm, birch, and oak were trees of broad stature, whose trunks rose haughtily into the sky. Of the trees of Lorn the oaks held dominion, and though Lorn's bowers were yet broad, covering all, the forest bed spread beneath a wide space of tall green lee and flowers, of which blues, yellows, and oranges favored most the petals which decked the lee-forest soil, amongst whom the favorites of Lorn's queen were the goans, and the asphodels, and the violet lilies, and the water lilies of the river Dawn, and all such delicate things whose hue were turquoise. Often then would the maidens gather those precious flowers, and weave them into crowns and headdresses for the queen to wear, whene'er she danced through the stoneless streets of their kingdom in parades and days of festivity. Of course, there was rarely a day without festivity, and rarely a day in which the queen of Lorn, nor her whole troop of maidens, could not be found upon the banks of the river Dawn, parading up and down it. Now the Dawn is indeed a mighty river, running yet nigh the breadth of all Lorn. The Aress is but a child of it, and its waters are pristine and sweet, almost twinkling like transparent sheets of ice beneath a star-clustered sky, ever freshly drawn from the mountains of Vain and Ur, which riseth to form the northernmost tips of the mountains of Anual Lunlas. Often have the unicorn drank and bathed upon its banks, for its current is gentle and filled with the song of shallow falls. And it was to them a beloved stream, and cherished greatly in their eyes. There was not a river in all the world which held such favor to those fairy, save that of the Esgaroth, for its lute was first conceived in the mind of Erdanos. Howbeit Ongwol played a part in that strand. Who has heard the call of ease and careless duty like streams, which having no want, have passed o'er polished stones of moss and days that will not die, when time is caught in webs of green and leaf, so that it passeth not? Such is becoming of elfin lands. And thus is the lay of Lorn, afore even upon the days of Vispilnas. Therefore it came to be that as the kingdom paradise of Lorn flourished and was increased in riches beyond measure, the dark elves built for Eudorus their king, and Eilifil their queen, and for their children, and for their children's children, a great city, a place and a palace in the heart of that wood, where they might gather and might dwell, a home for when their hearts wearied of carefree carousing. Oh, carefree carousing, careful for nothing, yet careful in everything, casting all care in the wisdom of joy and rejoicing. They named their dwelling place Methiliant, so ever was it called Methiliant, the fair city of Lorn. Here they dwelt beneath lightly thatched roofs of bark, in house and hamlet and homestead, where the air was clearest, and the wind often a sweet and gentle whistle. For those elves loved the shadow of the forest, and the sound of the world, which echoed near the roots of the trees, namely the oak. Many were the winged creatures, which perched and found home to nestle there amongst the elves, and delight in the melody of that people's speech, for they were fair-tongued and good-hearted. How is it that such a folk and city of elves hath endured beyond long and mournful ages, when the powers of Gothulian grew cruel and fierce, and more nobler of their fellows didst fall, with kingdoms and hearts broken and lost? To endure with trees planted by rivers of water, a city set on a hill, a dell of wood whose leaves have prospered in silent peace, though none could tell. Ere thus have many of the wood elves strived to imitate the glory of Methilian, and namely in the dark days of these later times, for its natural design was surely a safe haven from the four-footed and prowling servants of Minroth, and even more dastardly things which walked aright. Ere since the love of Eudorus and Eilifil has shone upon this world, did not Danethil, that great shepherd of old, tend with sleepless care the trees of Lorn, insomuch that they sprouted unmeasured indeed? As aforesaid, like a tree planted by rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season, and whose leaf shall not wither, thus stands the city of Methilian, for Iranian knoweth the way of the righteous. Oh, how lovely are thy oaks, O Lorn! Stand, stand! They shall not be moved from generation to generation in all the leaves of verdance, with bowers hung both low to touch the forest bed, and reaching to the upward uttermost airs. The wood shouldst seem to be a fortress of nature's verdant liberties, though yet the willow and the willow elm did surely have bowers bent lower upon the ground. These, however, are a rarer tree in that wood. Still many of those whose trunks stretch as tall as all the rest of that great wood, and seem to be a more precious ornament, hold no less a loveliness. For a tree, a solitary tree, has its own dominion, its own vast realm which exists within its bowers cast. To each tree, as to each star, there is a glory, for one differeth from another in glory, and so too doth one tree differeth from another. For one glory is heavenly, and another is terrestrial. What then of trees and stars? They are twain somehow, furtively in their immeasurable leagues apart, watching one another in the world, and to the glory of trees whom stand so stolidly, a row, a grove, a world, together gives both fashion and face to nature's character, and thusly in dominion, a majesty and grace given to elves and men. Mayhap it was the magic of Danehill, or as some have supposed, one of the lost Ivar, which kept that wood safe. So many oak, so great a grove, to stand amongst them, one might then know the mystery of their enduring beauty. Now of the willow, elm, birch, and oak, which grew amongst the woods of Lorne, were not the oak and birch the mightiest of these? The shepherd of those woods held these in highest favor, and namely the oak, for among them were his saplings named. However, in the depths of Lorne grew a thick grove of white and silver birch, though the stature of these trees was much less than the great oaks of Osengroth. Their roots were deep, and their bowers of a lengthy breadth. These trees stood as towers, whose crowns reached toward the sun, and in the long hours of the day their shadows ran the length of the outlying hills. The bark of their trunks ran smooth as stone, finely polished, and their leaves shimmered brightly in the twilight. All who came to behold this copse would say, Gemoaveth Eleuth Fenuel, which is to say, Behold the halls of the blessed. For their glory was not hidden. Here Eudorus pleased to dwell. These birches rooted beside a child of the dawn. This river did Eudorus bid his wife to name, and Eilifil called it Nadilian, for the joy of Nagan was reflected in its diminutive of cascades. Thus the sylph was pleased to linger nearby. Eudorus, however, often longed to dwell where he may yet gaze upon the stars and listen to their voices, as he had afore in those days upon the shores of Illuvius. Here it was amidst this grove of birch, whose towered trunks of white overwhelmed the stature of the oaks, that Eudorus would perch upon its bowers, and be lifted up between the earth and the heaven, to behold the sky unhidden by leaf, unbroken by bower. Here the buds bloomed long like rays from fountains, yet they were thick and soft like clouds, but strong as mountain stone. These birch were thus named Mythilian, and here Eudorus and his sylvan bride Eilifil carved the halls of Glimtwilloth. O elvish halls of silver birch, to stand Titanus above all Lorne! No oak nor elm should thus compare, a city marked not by walls nor roads, but rather the arching bowers. Such quiescent turbulence of beauty, 'tis the natural way of trees in fellowship one with another. A nurtured hall, a courtyard, choir lofts, and a great throne of royal elfinhood, with splendor like to gemstones, yet only made of wood. Here Eudorus cast his dominion as king of the dark elves. For dominion is to a king an ointment, which all precious things as silver and gold and spices and houses of armor and houses of treasure cannot increase. There is neither salve nor perfume, there is neither praise nor belauding, which shall console a goodly king, as to know that his dominion is one of righteousness and truth and meekness. Thus in the building of Glimtwilloth remembered Eudorus well the secrets of the honeydew halls, and the simple pleasures of those southeastern woods of tall, spicy pines, which Burbranch long ago tended, even in the days when Fay no longer dwelt in the east, insomuch that its presence seemed as but a shadow and an outline of the trees. The great courtyard of Glimtwilloth, which the elves built, met the forest below through a series of elegantly winding stairs, ornately carved and inlaid with wreaths of silver and wreaths of white and purple flowers. Rails woven of vine, strong as iron, girded the stairways. Bells brought they from Narn, of silver and of crystal, and many great bells yet of jasper and coral from the shores of Elfan, gifts from the kingdoms of Varnos, and yet even fine and thinly sculpted glass from the golden shores of Lufond, which were borne across the waters of Mertha Luvinum, and o'er the great bridge of Amen-Vreth. For in the days of Visvilnas was not Ozengroth still a mighty wood? These hung upon the rails of the stairways and bowers of the court, and all the banisters thereof, so that whene'er the wind blew, there was much music. The courtyard of Glim Twaloth lay broad and long. It ran the length of 5,000 paces, insomuch that a great host, tens of thousands, could stand within the court and before the choir of Lorn which did encircle it. Many lofts were built therein to house the musicians and bards. Hence did great laud ever fill those halls, yet no roof save the sky covered it. For the bowers of the great birches veiled, if desired, its guests from rain shouldst it fall. The wealth, the grace, and the splendor of Glim Twaloth were exceedingly great. Many gifts and treasures were brought there, and of all the lays of Mithlerian Vold, not even the halls of the gnomes rivaled the splendor of the halls of the dark elms, Glim Twaloth. A great dais stood upon the north end. There would the high esteemed and most renowned of the elven houses and nobler guests from afar find seats of honor. Oftentimes a great gathering would they make, a feast of majesties amongst that place, the kind of majesty which only those whom keep a furtive understanding, not of stone, but of nature's crowned redress, could craft, and thus express. Verdantly soft, verdesquely shimmering, 1,000 hues of green, a perfection of green both in light and in shadow, mingled with the walnut white of nacreous smooth trunks. The birchen walls expressed the echo of the stars, as though tapered and burning with cool jealousy. In the midst of the dais on the north end, the dark elves placed a throne. The throne 'twas the image of Eudorus' dominion as king. For a throne to a king is both a place of rest and toil. There he shall sit and muse with time, and there he shall sit and gaze with discerning eyes upon his fellow kinsmen. A throne to a king is both an ornament and a silent converse to those over which he hath dominion. For they come and stand before him, and behold his majesty where he sits. If he shouldst rise, they all. If he shouldst refrain, they all still. Yet a righteous king will not demand their marvel. Rather his grace will draw it from them freely. Thrones for both lord and queen set in the midst therein of that hall, carved by the hands of elfin artisans from fine wood, even the wood of white cedars and cherry bark oaks. And yet the thrones remained bare, bereft of jewels, of silver, and any fine stone that their grace be not hid. So absolute was the craftsmanship thereof. Thus, if one should stand in that hall and look onward, beholding the king of the dark elves upon his throne, one would see an image, a weld whose corded heights glistered faintly with the mist of starlight, and against which veil the birchen walls raked softly upward in the stillest motion of trees. A strange thing it might seem to behold such a broad pavilion so dimly lit, and still bright with the opalescent candor of open atmosphere. For in such a place of carefully balanced light, the king cast his shadow from his gnarled wooden throne, as one might cast his thoughts and cares, with hand gracefully beneath his chin. But for all the blessed nature of that woodland, and for all the verdant riches of that city, and the exceeding glory of Glim Twaloth, The beauty of Eliphalet and the skill of her harp and song far exceeded the treasures and the grandeur of those elven halls, and even far exceeded the shadow of the king when he cast himself into thought. All who came as guests to feast and dine and to make merry in Mytilene gave tell of the glory and the grandeur of that place. Yet when words of praise and extolation ceased, the tongues of all whomsoever spoke thenceward gave greater adulation, not to the treasure, nor laden therein, nor fashioned within those halls by the hands of the king's artisans, but their voices harped much concerning the sylvan queen Eliphalet. For was she not a sylvan queen of old, from the realms of Mytilene bold, from whence cometh all the nymphs? 'Tis said of those fairy damsels, are not even the modest among them fair, like queens among the elves, and even those esteemed plain of face, like goddesses among the maidens of men? And among them surely Eliphalet was fairest of all, for she was queen among them, and how much more so queen among the elves of that wood. As surely as the brides of the kings of the Eldar wore stars upon their brows, that they might shine forth in radiance to pierce the eyes of men, starless, but with the lilies of the dawn for a coronet, the beauty and grace of that queen illuminated her presence. As she sat thus upon her throne, poised like the petals of a white rose, or walking beneath the bowers of the white birch, below the moon's thricefold rays, did she not seem as Silmar, when Angwell's tender hand hath first stirred the year? Thus in those days the beauty of Eliphalet became the fame of those woods, and beyond, and the music of her golden harp, the perpetual sincerity of desire among both those whom dwelt in Lorne and all whom were its guests. Much can be said concerning the wealth, the grace, and the splendor of Glim Twiloth, for they were exceedingly great. As aforesaid, innumerable gifts and treasures were brought there by the countless guests of that grand court, namely the Fairy of Mytilene, and not a few of Narn. The courts of Glim Twiloth welcomed all from woodland realm and lea, sprites and fays from as far east as Lorlis, and yet even from Ilos in the west. And all who came brought gifts and tokens of fame and favor to the king of those woods, so that since those days, of a truth, the world has not seen nor heard of such a clamor in riches bestowed. During that age of shadowless hours, even the gnomes of the great hills came bearing precious stones and other treasures of the mountains. From kingdoms far and fabled they came, Vainandur and the distant regions of the south, Fondland and Nithregand. They came, ears overburdened with the fame of the beauty of that sylvan queen. So they longed to behold her face to face in the softness of her radiance, and with itching ears descry the harmony of her golden harp. Of a truth, no chord strummed has been more alluring to the souls of men than those spells which the sirens of the seas have cast upon the wayward sailor. Thus with their gifts shewed they favor upon favor, and their treasures and artifices were much renowned, for the lineage of the gnomes were proud and tall, and their shadows covered men, and the cleverness of their hands wrought boons with steadfastness as the turning of the continents. In those days were the hills of all the world overladen with countless store of gem and gold and other unnamed mystical things, which the dwarves eagerly sought after, in restless years hidden from starlight. For then were the kingdoms of gnomes free of fear and dragon flame. Never yet did they toil beneath the shadow of Urzagon, as did their children's children's children, in fetters of cruel steel. Nor yet were their backs bent from hard hours of toil and labor, fueled by the curse of their greed. With their devices and tools could they dig and delve, yet deeper into the hollows of the hills, with no fear or fright that perchance they should disturb some matchless doom in the deep. The gnomes loved most of all gold, pure, orate, and white. Many were the chalices, plates, ornamental headdresses, necklaces, bracelets, diadems, and rings, and musical instruments they wrought. Of these gladly bore they many works to Mithlerian, for there was great love between them, for they longed to see their treasures done justice upon a portrait of true beauty. Amongst the kingdoms of the gnomes, Fiandos stood as a prince among kings, the mightiest in stature and the wisest among them. The cities he carved of mountain stone were vast, with halls wide like open leaves, and ceilings lofty like open sky, studded with many a precious gem, insomuch that to whomsoever walked therein it would seem to be the open sky, illuminated with all the brilliance of the heavens. Hence there were none among the Phaean princes of old whom bestowed greater gifts and hoards of treasures to lay at the feet of Alaphil. Behold, Fiandos is the mighty Dane of Fondilon, and his sons the princes of 1,000 hills, so that those whom beheld the treasures of his kingdoms and the gifts of favor to that sylvan queen should gaze with sparkled eyes, even the meager and modest trinkets among them. Of all the sons of Fiandos, Nandos is the most renowned. He shaped the stone beneath the great hills of Gilgarond, and built that fabled city Nithregand from the treasures thereof. For a brief time even, long before moonlight first painted the peaks of that region, he set himself a throne upon the crown of Maiden, so that he might behold the world and the wonders thereof. Howbeit Nandos had a restless heart, and came to and fro more often than his father or his kinsmen. He loved most to see the awe upon the faces of the elves when he shewed his wondrous gifts to them. But more so, he delighted to tantalize the ears of the elves and fill the courts of Glimtwilloth with a wealth of tales, lores, and myths, even tales of things pertaining to the gods and treasures not meant for men. Perhaps his words, more than any other, stirred the hearts of the elves to hoard such great treasures and love them with a great love akin to the gem lust which the gnomes filled in their own hearts. For lust is but a strong desire, a cupidity for crafted beauty, and there are none whom had loves of starlight turned stone like the gnomes, save the dark elves. Thence it is that Nandos above all the Fae of old gave gift of gem and treasure bedaubed. Of the fairies and fays whom went to and fro from that wood, the dryads and nymphs, sylphs and sylphs, the sprites and winged things, and all the Phaean lords and princesses, the unicorn are the most fabled. They were servants of the Elmarith, and the principal instruments of musical chord in that age when they lived among men, and they possessed a magic which has often been mistaken as furtive in design rather than elegantly subtle. But this is the common mistake of men to make, not of elves. By reason of their favor upon Alaphil, for in days afore, before Eudor stole her heart, she sat upon the shores of Nagan, and harped to their voices, and did their presence and song always grace the courts and terraces of Glimtwilloth. The grace and skill of their song and the harmony of them is legend in all the realms of Elfand. Even in the plainness of their speech did words pour forth with the gentleness of dawn. There is no garble in them, but the reveries of their voices are benumbing, marked symphonies, each word spoken a masterpiece of music. The chief choir lofts were reserved for them, those lofts of rainbow-laden waterfalls, of thin mist-like sacred pools of dew gathered upon the tightened buds of mauve and green. Here would the unicorn sing for all Mythilian's hosts. Their voices ever prevailed, and the noise thereof is the emblem of that age, though there are none now whom can recall, nor even grotesquely mimic it. Thus of a truth and verity it can be surmised indeed that more than the gifts of the gnomes and fairy of the West, and more than the forest majesty of the dark elves, 'twas the presence of the unicorn which befamed Lorn in those days. Now of those unicorn which lingered oft in Lorn and the halls of Glim-Twilloth, Muthamir was most beloved, and his bride Northelfin, whom never left his side. For it is a truth that unicorns have always dwelt in twos, bride and bridegroom. Also of a true delight was Mintheol the golden-maned. His mane flowed golden as though the sand of Lufon colored in his hair. Yet Mintheol had a coat as white as pearls in the snow, and yet as purely bright as the crown of Fondilon, glistening in the timeless sky. Many there were who loved and favored his ballad most of all, and Finor was his nearest kin. The lord of the unicorns is Mehior by name. He is most belauded among the songs of the elves. Mehior held a great love for the dark elves and their woodland leas, at such times in which he did bless that kingdom, by making merry in the courts of Glim-Twilloth. All whom dwelt therein rejoiced with much gladness and fervor. Such is the rare celestine power of his song. The dark elves surely would have proffered every priceless treasure and splendor to hear the music of his voice. Those were days of which none in all the world above shouldst dare to depart from. For there was surely not a voice, nay, not even of the queens of the sylphs, so pure in strands of joy and melodic skill as that of Mehior. No voice since has overcome that of Mehior, be it for voice or plain, in words and sound. There is indeed no vein of vibrant note so clear and unrefrained, ever broke from silence upon the dawn or death of worlds. For like a mallet to shatter brittle sheets of night, such a vocal chord perhaps found Minroth quaking in his tower. Yet let us not forget that the dark elves themselves boasted many a renowned bard and minstrel, so that the choirs of those halls ever rang out mightily. Perhaps the number of them surmounted the guests and those whom dwelt thereby. There were pipers and harpers, and flutists whom played on instruments finely crafted by fay and elf alike. Their instruments shined as brass, polished and brazen, and dipped in starfire. The harpers strummed with graceful delicateness, as though they played on strands of silk and starlight streaked between the morning and evening mist. So it is, no music in all the world is so famed amongst the elves as that of Lorn, and that which cometh from the choirs of Glim-Twilloth. Where else in all the world of men and elves have the unicorn come, and sang together in unison, save but upon the dawning of the world, and that grievous day when the moons wept? Nay, there is none to rival it, save perhaps that which rose in blissful melancholy upon the shoals of Doff Lemore. For those fellows were minstrels to the gods. Their songs have descended upon the shores of the world whene'er the mist is drawn from the sea. None the less, Eliphael's boasted as the favorite of Angvil, and with the golden and opal harp, Leifane, played on silver strings plucked from the mane of Mehior, did she daily fill those halls with praise. And hers was music of the old world, that of the fairies and the nymphs, and of songs no less sweetly played, as though Maithrin Voss had burst open and flowed before them all. And of a truth, as there have been none whose hands have played the bow as skillfully as a harp, save perhaps Aphilos, albeit she was a maiden and of the lineage of men, and thus not held in the high esteem of elfin lore. For here is a tale the elves cannot speak in particular of. For was not Aphilos a maiden of Galanoth? and of all the kingdoms of men is theirs least remembered, though often well spoken of. For did not the wrath of Nimrod come swiftly upon them, when first he made his war with men? Thus is the splendor and glory and the lay of Lord, and the might of its kingdom, insomuch that the elves of those regions, numbered in the thousands, and even the thousand of thousands, they prospered and were blessed. Many were their craftsmen, who were skilled in fashioning devices of archery and instruments of music, flutes and pipes, harps and mandolins. And the gardens of Lorne flourished with the most exotic of flowers and shrubs, insomuch that Ongworld herself would surely have flustered to walk among them, and to breathe in the many pleasant scents of their delicate and silky petals. By reason of these things, the hearts of the elves grew fat with joy, and filled with honey and wine, insomuch that there was never a whisper, nor yet a mischievous spirit, who dared to think the days of Iphilloth should come to end. Howbeit Alephil kept silent the gift of her foresight. What things were spoken once would she not dare to utter again, for fear she may yet bring a darker charm upon her beloved, or yet her beloved's children, in reference to the enchanting of Eudorus. Nevertheless, Eudorus remembered well the words of Alephil, and it pleased him well to see his children grow strong and wise, for all of them did he teach in the way of the bow, and their learning was mighty indeed. Careful was the craftsmanship of brave fame. It wert of a truth the mightiest of all gifts given by Mindar to the elves of Lorne. The wisdom of that tool well esteemed even farther in the east in days anon. Long strove Eudorus in the mastering of that device, though yet he possessed a natural talent for it. Thence it came to pass that not only did the children of those beloved fairy, Eudorus and Alephil, grow in number and stature, but as well did the shadow of their kingdom encompass all the woods of the Mithlaren laurels, and even farther west, to the very edges of Daglisson. For yet were there fairy in Daglisson whose hearts were softly turned towards them. Thus it was that among the Phaean kingdoms of that age, none encompassed so vast a land than that of the Mithlaren laurels, save for that of Mithlerian Wold, though yet the glory of Mithlerian Wold is rarely spoken of by the elves, for they are named a secret sect of the fairy. From them come all the children of nymphs and dryads, and the sprites and princesses of the woods. Howbeit, long has it been years since they fled, before yet even the dark brow of Minroth hath turned his desire toward the west.